Somewhere in the Ethiopian highlands, buried in a cool, dry cave for over 4,000 years, one man's skeleton was waiting to expose something scientists had gotten completely wrong about an entire continent. When researchers finally sequenced his DNA in 2015, they weren't just adding one more ancient genome to the record. They were about to discover that a massive migration, one that reshaped the genetic makeup of Africa from the Horn all the way down to South Africa, had been sitting there invisible, hiding in plain sight, mistaken for something else entirely, until this one comparison exposed it. And that is not even where Ethiopia's genetic story begins. This same country is also home to some of the oldest anatomically modern human remains ever discovered anywhere on Earth. Bones, now dated at over 200,000 years old. Two entirely different chapters of human history, one impossibly ancient, one shockingly recent, both written into the DNA of the same small region. And until very recently, almost nobody could connect them. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that ancient Ethiopian skeleton revealed, why it fundamentally changed how scientists understand African population history, and why nearly every sub-Saharan African population alive today, whether they know it or not, carries a genetic signature connected directly to this one discovery. Here's the promise. First, we're going back to the oldest known evidence of our species, found right here in Ethiopia. Then we're jumping forward to that cave in the highlands, where one buried man's DNA exposed a migration nobody saw coming. And by the end, you'll understand the one genetic connection that changed how we think about Africa's deep past entirely. Stay until the end, because there's a detail in this discovery that even shocked the researchers who found it. A detail buried in what was missing from the DNA, not what was there. Let's start with the bones first, since that part of the story comes first chronologically. Back in 1967, a team led by paleontologist Richard Leakey uncovered the first Omo remains near the Omo River in southwestern Ethiopia. For decades, the exact age of these bones remained uncertain, dated using imprecise methods that placed them somewhere in a wide, uncertain range. Then in 2022, a team of researchers used a completely different dating method, analyzing volcanic ash layers found directly above and below the skeletal remains. Volcanic ash can be dated with remarkable precision because it contains radioactive elements that decay at a known fixed rate, and the new date they calculated was staggering. The Omo remains are now dated to at least 230,000 years old, making them among the oldest confirmed anatomically modern human fossils found anywhere on the planet. But here's the part that really matters for this video. Finding 230,000-year-old bones tells you when humans existed. It does not tell you what happened to their descendants, how they moved, who they mixed with, or what genetic legacy they left behind. Bones, that old, almost never contain usable DNA. The genetic material simply doesn't survive that long in most environments, especially not in a hot region like Ethiopia. So for the deeper genetic story, researchers had to look somewhere else entirely. That search led them to a cave called Mota in the Ethiopian highlands and to a skeleton far younger than the Omo remains, but genetically far more revealing. In 2015, a team led by geneticist Andrea Manica successfully extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from a skeleton found in Mota Cave, a male individual who lived approximately 4,500 years ago, whose remains happened to be preserved in unusually cool, dry conditions inside the cave, conditions that gave the DNA a rare chance to survive for millennia in a region where genetic material almost never does. This single skeleton became one of the most important ancient genomes ever recovered from Africa. And here's why. Researchers didn't just want to know who Mota Man was, they wanted to compare his DNA against modern populations across Africa and the wider world, to see exactly how ancient East African ancestry connects to everyone living today. What they found didn't just add information, it exposed something that had been completely invisible until that moment. Here's the twist. Before this study, geneticists already knew that almost every population living outside of Africa carries a small amount of Eurasian ancestry connected to the migration that took modern humans out of Africa tens of thousands of years ago. That part wasn't surprising. What was surprising is what researchers found when they looked closely at modern sub-Saharan African populations, far from Ethiopia, in places like West Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. These populations also carried small but detectable traces of Eurasian ancestry, a pattern nobody had fully explained. For years, some scientists assumed this must be some ancient, deep signal left over from the earliest migrations in and out of the continent tens of thousands of years ago. Mota Man's DNA proved that assumption wrong, because Mota Man, who lived 4,500 years ago in the Ethiopian highlands, had essentially none of this Eurasian ancestry. If that ancient Eurasian signal in modern sub-Saharan Africans really was some ancient leftover from tens of thousands of years ago, Mota Man should have carried it too. He didn't. That single missing piece changed everything. It meant the Eurasian ancestry found across sub-Saharan Africa today did not arrive in some ancient, forgotten wave tens of thousands of years ago. It arrived recently, sometime after Mota Man died, 4,500 years ago and before the present day. An entirely new migration wave swept back into Africa from Eurasia and spread far more widely across the continent than anyone had previously realized. Researchers were able to narrow the timing down further. Using genetic dating techniques that measure how DNA segments break apart and shorten over generations, they calculated that this Eurasian backflow migration most likely occurred around 3,000 years ago, arriving from the direction of the Near East, crossing into the Horn of Africa, and then spreading outward, not just staying in Ethiopia, but reaching populations thousands of kilometers away, all the way into West and Central and Southern Africa. Think about the scale of that for a second. A single migration event, invisible until researchers compared one ancient skeleton against the modern world, turned out to have genetically reshaped an entire continent. So who exactly triggered this migration? That question sent researchers looking at a completely different piece of evidence: agriculture. Around 3,000 years ago, something changed in the Horn of Africa. Crops and livestock associated with populations from the Arabian Peninsula started appearing in the archaeological record. This lines up almost exactly with the genetic timing Mota Man's DNA revealed. Researchers now believe a population from the South Arabian region, likely bringing early farming and animal herding practices, crossed the narrow strait separating modern Yemen from the Horn of Africa, and settled among existing populations in the Ethiopian highlands. But here's where it gets more complicated. This wasn't just a small local event confined to Ethiopia. The genetic signal from this migration shows up as far away as Nigeria, as far south as populations in southern Africa, thousands of kilometers from where it started. How does a single migration event spread that far, that widely, in just 3,000 years? The answer connects to something we've covered on this channel before: the Bantu expansion. The massive movement of Niger-Congo-speaking farming populations that spread language, culture, and DNA across Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa over thousands of years. Researchers now believe that by the time this Eurasian back migration reached East Africa, it didn't stay isolated. It mixed into populations who were themselves in the middle of spreading outward across the continent, carried along by the same wave of population movement and intermarriage that was already reshaping Africa's genetic map. In other words, this wasn't one migration. It was one migration event that got picked up and carried by several others already in motion, spreading its genetic signature across an area far larger than the original migrants themselves ever physically traveled. This is exactly the kind of finding that could only be uncovered by comparing ancient DNA directly against modern populations. Without Mota Man's genome as a fixed point from 4,500 years ago, researchers would have had no way to prove this migration was recent instead of ancient. The date itself was the discovery. Now, let's talk about what this migration actually did to Ethiopia itself, because the effects there are even more dramatic than what happened elsewhere on the continent. Modern Ethiopian populations, unlike Mota Man, typically carry a substantial proportion of this Eurasian-related ancestry, in some communities estimated at 40 to 50% of their overall genome. That's an enormous shift in just 3,000 years, a blink of an eye in genetic terms. But it didn't happen evenly. And this is where things get really interesting. Different Ethiopian ethnic and linguistic communities today carry dramatically different proportions of this ancestry. Populations speaking Semitic languages, including Amhara and Tigray communities, tend to show the highest proportions of Eurasian-related ancestry, closely tracking the historical spread of Semitic languages into the region from South Arabia. Populations speaking Cushitic languages, including Oromo and Somali communities, show somewhat different proportions, reflecting a more complex, layered history of contact and mixing across the region. And populations speaking Omotic languages, found specifically in southwestern Ethiopia, in some cases including populations living closer to where the ancient Omo remains were originally discovered, show notably lower levels of this Eurasian ancestry, some of the closest genetic matches researchers have found anywhere to that deep, ancient East African ancestral layer. This means Ethiopia today isn't one genetic population. It's a living map of exactly how this migration spread unevenly across the region, layered right on top of the deepest, oldest human ancestry found anywhere on the planet. And there's one more Ethiopian population whose genetic story adds an entirely separate layer to all of this. The Beta Israel, also known as Ethiopian Jews, are a community with a documented history in Ethiopia stretching back many centuries, practicing a form of Judaism that developed with limited contact from Jewish communities elsewhere in the world for an extremely long period of time. For decades, their exact origin was debated, some traditions describing descent connected to ancient Israelite migration, others pointing toward a local Ethiopian conversion at some point in the more recent past. genetic studies comparing Beta Israel populations to other Ethiopian communities and separately to Jewish diaspora populations elsewhere in the world, including the Ashkenazi populations we covered in an earlier video, found something clear. Beta Israel populations are genetically very closely related to other Ethiopian populations, sharing the same broad ancestral foundation, including the same layered mix of deep African ancestry, and the more recent Eurasian backflow migration we've been discussing this entire video. They do not show a close genetic match to Middle Eastern Jewish populations, the way some historical traditions suggested. This doesn't erase or diminish Beta Israel identity or religious history. What it shows is a population whose religious tradition developed largely independently within Ethiopia, among people whose genetic ancestry connects primarily to their Ethiopian neighbors, not to a direct, unbroken migration from the ancient Middle East. A conclusion that adds yet another layer of complexity to how identity, religion, and genetics can diverge from each other, a pattern we've seen again and again throughout every video in this series. Now here's something almost nobody talks about, and it might be the single strangest piece of Ethiopian genetics researchers have found. If you've ever heard about Tibetan populations having a special genetic adaptation that lets them survive at extreme high altitude, or about Andean populations in Peru having their own separate high altitude adaptation, you might assume Ethiopian highland populations, who also live at extreme elevation, would share one of those same genetic solutions. They don't. Ethiopian highlanders evolved their own completely independent genetic adaptation to high altitude, different from both the Tibetan and the Andean versions. Researchers studying populations in the Ethiopian highlands, some living at elevations above 3,000 meters, found that they handle low oxygen environments without the same physiological adjustments seen in Tibetan or Andean populations. Tibetans typically have unusually low hemoglobin concentration at altitude, an efficient adaptation linked to specific variants in a gene called EPAS1, inherited, remarkably, from ancient interbreeding with Denisovans. Andean populations instead show elevated hemoglobin levels, a different evolutionary solution to the same problem. Ethiopian highlanders show neither pattern clearly. Their blood oxygen saturation levels remain high, comparable to populations living at sea level, using a genetic mechanism scientists still do not fully understand. Multiple candidate genes have been proposed, but no single clear genetic explanation has been definitively confirmed the way it has for Tibetan and Andean populations. This means Ethiopia independently evolved a third, entirely separate genetic solution to the exact same survival problem, a solution scientists are still actively trying to fully decode today. 3 different human populations, 3 different continents, 3 completely independent evolutionary answers to surviving at extreme altitude. And Ethiopia's remains the least understood of all 3. Let's connect this back to where we started, because there's one more twist worth explaining. Remember, the Omo remains, dated to 230,000 years ago, are among the oldest anatomically modern human fossils ever found. That means the deep human story in Ethiopia goes back further than almost anywhere else on Earth. But the Eurasian backflow migration we've spent most of this video explaining only happened 3,000 years ago. That's not a contradiction. It's actually the whole point. Ethiopia carries 2 completely different chapters of human history layered directly on top of each other, one stretching back over 200,000 years, connecting to the very origin of our species, and one only 3,000 years old, a genetic event so recent it happened after the pyramids of Egypt were already over 1,000 years old. And here's a detail that surprises most people when they hear it for the first time. The Omotic-speaking populations we mentioned earlier, the ones showing the lowest levels of Eurasian ancestry today, live in almost the exact same region of southwestern Ethiopia, where the ancient Omo remains were originally discovered. That's not officially proven to be a direct, unbroken line of descent stretching across 230,000 years. That kind of claim would go far beyond what the evidence can actually support. But it does mean this specific corner of Ethiopia has remained a relatively stable, continuously inhabited region for an almost unimaginable stretch of human history, largely bypassed by the Eurasian migration that reshaped so much of the rest of the country and the continent. Researchers studying this region describe it as one of the closest living genetic windows we have anywhere on Earth into what East African populations may have looked like, genetically, before that migration 3,000 years ago ever happened. Now let's talk about why the single genome from one man buried in one cave mattered enough to rewrite textbooks. Before Mota Man's genome was sequenced in 2015, geneticists studying African population history had almost no ancient DNA reference points from sub-Saharan Africa at all. Every estimate about how populations moved, mixed, and migrated across the continent had to be reconstructed indirectly, using only modern DNA and complicated statistical modeling, essentially working backward without ever being able to check the math against a real physical ancient sample. Mota Man changed that completely. He became the first solid, ancient anchor point researchers could use to test their models against actual physical evidence from the deep past. And the very first thing that Anchor Point revealed was that one of the field's core assumptions, that this Eurasian genetic signal in Africa was ancient, was flat out wrong. That is a genuinely enormous deal within the field of population genetics. It means every study published before 2015, estimating the age of this migration using indirect methods alone, had gotten the timing wrong, off by tens of thousands of years. One single skeleton, one single genome, ended up rewriting the entire migration timeline for a whole continent, and Mota Man didn't stay alone for long. His discovery kicked off a genuine race across the continent to find more ancient African genomes. In 2017, a much larger study led by geneticist Pontus Skoglund analyzed ancient DNA from 16 individuals recovered from sites across eastern and southern Africa, spanning an enormous range of time, from 8,000 years ago all the way up to just a few hundred years ago. The study confirmed and expanded on what Mota Man first revealed, mapping out in far more detail exactly how the Eurasian backflow migration, the Bantu expansion, and several other ancient population movements interacted across the continent over thousands of years. Each new ancient genome recovered since then has added another data point to this map, and researchers are still actively excavating and sequencing new sites across Africa right now, meaning the picture painted in this video is not the final version. It's the current best understanding, built on a foundation that Mota Man's genome was the very first piece of, and it keeps getting more detailed every single year. Here's why this matters if you're watching this and you have African ancestry, from anywhere on the continent, not just Ethiopia. If you've ever taken a consumer DNA test and seen a small percentage listed as West Asian, or Middle Eastern, or Eurasian, mixed in alongside your African ancestry results, this is very likely where that percentage is coming from. Not a mistake in the test, not some unrelated recent event in your own specific family history. A genuine 3,000-year-old migration that reshaped the genetic map of the entire continent, and one that an entire generation of geneticists didn't even know had happened until they compared one ancient skeleton against the modern world. That is genuinely the connection that changed everything, not just for Ethiopia specifically, but for how scientists now read the DNA of people across the entire African continent, and by extension, in the diaspora communities we've covered throughout this series, from the Yoruba to the Igbo to African American populations across the United States. Now, let's talk about how researchers actually pulled usable DNA out of a 4,500-year-old skeleton in the first place, because in a region like Ethiopia, that's genuinely difficult. Most environments in Africa are hot and humid, conditions that destroy DNA relatively quickly compared to cooler climates in Europe or Central Asia. This is exactly why, for decades, ancient DNA research made huge strides in places like Europe, while Africa remained almost a complete blank on the map. Mota Cave turned out to be the exception that made this entire discovery possible. Its interior stayed cool and dry year-round, conditions close to ideal for preserving genetic material, and researchers specifically targeted a bone called the petrous, the dense part of the skull near the inner ear, because it protects DNA better than almost any other part of the human skeleton. Without that one lucky combination, a naturally cool cave and the right bone, this entire discovery might never have happened at all. It's worth pausing on just how narrow the window for this entire discovery actually was. Mota Cave's cool, dry conditions are considered unusual for the region specifically because most of Ethiopia, like most of tropical and subtropical Africa, simply does not preserve DNA well at all. Researchers estimate that the vast majority of ancient human remains recovered from similar African sites over the past century have yielded no usable genetic material whatsoever, meaning Mota Man's genome represents an enormous stroke of preservation, luck layered on top of deliberate, careful scientific technique, the kind of rare combination that makes every successful African ancient DNA extraction, even now, a genuinely significant event worth paying close attention to. There's one more thing worth mentioning before we wrap this up, because it puts Ethiopia's genetic story in a wider context. Similar backflow migrations from Eurasia into Africa have now been documented in other regions too, including a separate, distinct wave into North Africa thousands of years earlier than the one we've covered today. This means Africa's genetic history was never a simple, one-directional story of people leaving the continent and never coming back. It was a two-way relationship, with multiple, separate waves of people moving back into Africa at different points across tens of thousands of years, each one leaving its own distinct genetic fingerprint, each one requiring its own separate ancient DNA discovery to fully understand. Ethiopia just happens to be the place where one of the clearest, most precisely dated examples of this pattern was finally uncovered, thanks to one cave, one skeleton, and one comparison against the modern world that nobody expected to turn out the way it did. Let's go back to that ethnic breakdown for a second, because there's a detail we skipped over that's worth unpacking on its own. Researchers didn't just find that Semitic-speaking, Cushitic-speaking, and Omotic-speaking populations carry different proportions of Eurasian ancestry. They found that this pattern lines up almost perfectly with a completely separate field of research, historical linguistics, the study of how languages spread and change over time. Linguists studying Ethiopian language history, working entirely independently from geneticists, had already proposed that Semitic languages arrived in Ethiopia from South Arabia sometime in the last few thousand years, based purely on vocabulary, grammar, and written historical records. When the genetic dating from Mota Man's genome came out years later, it matched the linguists' timeline almost exactly. Two completely separate fields of science, using completely separate types of evidence, DNA on one side, language structure on the other, arrived at the same conclusion independently. That kind of convergence almost never happens by accident. When it does, researchers treat it as some of the strongest possible evidence a historical event actually occurred exactly the way both fields describe it. There's also a modern, living piece of evidence for this migration that has nothing to do with laboratories at all, and you might already be familiar with it without realizing what it actually represents. Ethiopian cuisine, Ethiopian coffee culture, and Ethiopian religious architecture all show documented historical connections to South Arabian influence. Connections historians have studied for decades using trade records, religious texts, and archaeological remains, entirely separate from any genetic evidence. Injera, the fermented flatbread central to Ethiopian cuisine and coffee itself, believed to have originated in Ethiopia before spreading to the Arabian Peninsula and back again through centuries of trade, both sit inside this same broader story of connection and exchange across the narrow strait separating the Horn of Africa from South Arabia, a relationship stretching back thousands of years, one that shaped culture, cuisine, religion, and, as we now know, thanks to one ancient skeleton, DNA itself. There's actually a fascinating footnote to the coffee story that most people never hear, and it connects directly back to genetics in a way you might not expect. Botanists studying wild coffee plants native to the Ethiopian highlands have found that Ethiopia hosts by far the greatest genetic diversity of coffee plants found anywhere on Earth. Far more variation than in any of the countries that grow coffee commercially today, almost all of which descend from just a small handful of plants originally exported from Ethiopia centuries ago. In other words, the exact same pattern we've spent this entire video describing. In human DNA, deep, ancient, unmatched genetic diversity concentrated specifically in Ethiopia, layered with a smaller, more recent population that spread outward and now dominates the wider world, shows up again in an entirely different species growing in the exact same hills. It's the same underlying story told twice, once in the coffee plants and once in the people who first cultivated them. Here's one more thread worth pulling before we close this out, because it circles back to a question a lot of people ask the moment they hear about ancient migrations like this one: does this change what it means to be Ethiopian? Researchers who work directly with Ethiopian communities on this kind of genetic research are consistent on this point, and it's worth repeating clearly. Genetic ancestry describes where DNA traveled from over thousands of years. It does not describe identity, culture, language, or belonging, all of which are built through lived history, shared community, and continuous tradition, not through a percentage on a genetic report. Ethiopia's modern identity, spanning dozens of distinct ethnic communities, each with their own language, history, and culture, was shaped by thousands of years of contact, migration, and exchange, not despite that layered genetic history, but because of it. If anything, what this research shows is that Ethiopia has always been a place where different populations met, mixed, and built something new together, from the earliest anatomically modern humans walking near the Omo River over 200,000 years ago, straight through to a farming population crossing a narrow strait from South Arabia 3,000 years ago, and continuing right up to the incredibly diverse, multilingual, genetically layered country that exists today. That's not a complicated footnote to Ethiopian history. In a very real sense, it is Ethiopian history, written directly into the DNA of everyone who calls this region home. So let's bring this all together. Scientists compared Ethiopian DNA with ancient African DNA, and one connection changed everything. Not a slow, ancient migration nobody could pin down, but a specific, datable, 3,000-year-old wave that reshaped the genetic map of an entire continent, hidden until one man's skeleton, buried in one cool, dry cave in the Ethiopian highlands, exposed it by what his DNA was missing. 230,000 years of deep human history at Omo. A hidden migration exposed by Mota Man's genome in 2015. A completely independent, still not fully understood genetic adaptation to high altitude found nowhere else on Earth. A community, the Beta Israel, whose genetics tell a different story than some historical traditions once claimed. And a genetic signature that didn't just stay in Ethiopia, but rode along the same wave of population movement that reshaped Africa from west to east to south. That's not one discovery. That's 5 separate connected discoveries, all traced back to comparing modern Ethiopian DNA against the deep ancient past. And every single one of them started with a single question: what happens when you actually check? If this video helped you understand what Ethiopian DNA really reveals, subscribe, because next week we're breaking down another population's DNA mystery that's never been fully explained, and the results from that story might surprise you even more than this Ethiopian DNA discovery did. And if you have Ethiopian ancestry, or East African ancestry more broadly, tell me in the comments, which part of this video was completely new to you? Researchers around the world are still digging, quite literally, and the next ancient African genome recovered could rewrite this entire story again, just as fast as Mota Man's genome did back in 2015. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.